Christmas Eve had always felt special to Kevin McCallister. There was something magical about the city of New York during the holidays. The way the streets were lit with bright, festive lights, the sound of carolers echoing down avenues, and the chill of snow swirling through the air. He had been separated from his family, again, but for Kevin, this had always been part of the fun. This time, though, he had come prepared. Having outsmarted the wet bandits twice, he knew they would be back with vengeance in their hearts. And as fate would have it, he had spotted them again, Harry and Marv, slinking through the snowy streets of New York, their eyes glinting with malice. Kevin trailed them from a safe distance, his instincts sharp. He knew they were up to no good, and when he overheard them discussing robbing Duncan's toy chest, Kevin had made up his mind. They weren't getting away with it. As Kevin ducked behind a tree, watching the wet bandits sneak toward the toy store, a strange unease crept over him. Something about the city tonight felt different. There was an odd tension in the air. A chill that wasn't just from the December cold. It was as if the entire city had an underlying fear. Something Kevin couldn't quite put his finger on. Kevin waited patiently outside Duncan's toy chest, crafting his plan as he peered into the glowing windows. Inside, Harry and Marv were already scoping out the layout, inspecting the security systems. Kevin pulled the collar of his jacket up against the biting wind, knowing he had to act quickly. In the distance, the soft ringing of carolers and the hum of holiday traffic gave the city its usual festive backdrop, but beneath it all, Kevin felt a dark current of dread. He wasn't the only one watching the wet bandits. Unbeknownst to all of them, Jason Voorhees had been stalking the streets of New York, his presence masked by the anonymity of the city's chaos. Fresh off his killing spree from the events in Jason Takes Manhattan, Jason had found himself in New York once more, drawn by an unspoken call. A dark magnetism that seemed to pull him toward the chaos and filth of the city. Jason had been hunting all night, slipping through the alleyways like a phantom. Blood had already stained his machete, and bodies littered the dark corners of the city, unseen by the holiday shoppers. The wet bandits were not his initial targets, but when they entered the same alleyways that Jason prowled, they had unknowingly walked into his domain. Inside Duncan's toy chest, Harry and Marv prepared to rob the store, entirely unaware of the nightmare waiting for them outside. Kevin, his heart pounding with adrenaline, crept closer to the window, hiding behind a stack of oversized stuffed bears as he watched the wet bandits from a safe distance. "Are you sure no alarms will go off?" Marv whispered, clutching his crowbar tightly as he glanced around nervously. His voice shook, his fear of another Kevin-related incident clearly lingering. Harry, ever the more confident of the two, rolled his eyes and smirked. "Relax, Marv. The kid isn't here this time. No more tricks, no more traps. We're in and out before anyone knows what happened." Kevin's mind raced as he began formulating a new plan. He would catch them red-handed, if only he could distract them long enough to call the police, maybe set a trap in the store itself. The thought brought a mischievous grin to his face. This was what Kevin was good at, turning ordinary places into danger zones for crooks. But before he could act, a shadow moved outside the window. At first, Kevin thought it was just his imagination. The city was filled with strange figures at night, homeless people, workers, tourists. But this shadow was different. It was large, impossibly large, and it moved with a slow, deliberate menace that made Kevin's stomach turn. He squinted, trying to make out the figure in the snow, but it stayed just out of the light. Marv suddenly turned toward the door, his face twisted in confusion. "Harry, did you hear something?" "Shut up, Marv," Harry hissed. "You're always hearing things. Focus." Kevin's eyes were glued to the shadow now, his breath catching in his throat as he realized it wasn't just anyone standing outside the store. It was a man, or at least something that looked like a man, but larger, broader, with a strange white mask covering his face. A machete glinted in the dim glow of the streetlights. Without warning, the front door of the store creaked open. Kevin's heart leaped into his throat as he ducked behind the display, watching as the shadowy figure entered the store, moving with heavy, deliberate steps. "Who's there?" Harry demanded, stepping forward, his gun already drawn. "You better get out of here if you know what's good for you." Jason stood in the doorway, unmoving, the dim light reflecting off his mask. Kevin peered through the gap between two large toy boxes, his pulse racing as he recognized the sheer size of the intruder. This wasn't some petty thief, this was something far worse. "I said get out of here," Harry yelled again, but his voice wavered slightly as he cocked his gun. Marv, gripping his crowbar tightly, stepped up beside Harry. "What's the big deal? It's just some weirdo. We can handle him." But before they could react, Jason lunged. Marv swung the crowbar with all his strength, landing multiple blows on Jason's chest. The sound of metal striking flesh echoed through the toy store. But Jason barely reacted. His thick, weathered body absorbed the hits like they were nothing more than a light breeze. Kevin, watching from behind the toys, felt his stomach twist. This wasn't like any battle he had witnessed before. The traps, the tricks, the pranks, none of them could stop someone like this. Jason reached out, his hand clamping around Marv's throat with terrifying strength. Marv's crowbar slipped from his hand as he gasped for air, his legs kicking wildly. In a horrifying display of power, Jason slammed Marv against the wall, pinning him with ease. The cracking of bones echoed through the room as Marv's struggles ceased, his body going limp in Jason's grasp. "Marv!" Harry screamed, his face pale with terror. He raised the gun and fired, the sharp crack of bullets filling the store. But the shots had little effect. Jason turned his cold, expressionless mask toward Harry, his eyes void of any emotion. Harry's hands trembled as he backed away, but Jason was faster. In one swift movement, Jason closed the distance between them, grabbing Harry's head in both hands. With a sickening crunch, Jason crushed Harry's skull, his body falling lifelessly to the floor beside Marv. Kevin couldn't breathe. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. The wet bandits, his longtime nemeses, were gone, killed with brutal efficiency. And now, standing over their bodies, Jason Voorhees turned his gaze toward Kevin's hiding spot. Kevin's instincts took over. He bolted from his hiding place, his small body weaving between shelves and toys, as Jason began his slow, relentless pursuit. The sound of Jason's heavy footsteps followed him through the store, each step filled with the promise of death. In his panic, Kevin stumbled over Harry's fallen body. His heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, his eyes catching the glint of a revolver sticking out of Harry's jacket. Without thinking, Kevin grabbed the gun, his hands trembling as he clutched it tightly. Jason was getting closer. Kevin could hear the heavy breathing behind the mask, feel the icy presence of death creeping toward him. He needed to get out. He needed to run. With the revolver in hand, Kevin burst out of Duncan's toy chest and into the frigid New York streets. The city lights seemed to blur around him as he sprinted through the crowds, weaving between holiday shoppers and carolers who had no idea what kind of horror lurked behind him. Jason followed, his towering figure cutting through all of the festive atmosphere like a knife through butter. He didn't need to run. His pace was steady, unstoppable. Kevin's mind raced as he dodged through the city streets. He had always been able to outsmart Harry and Marv, but this was different. This wasn't some petty criminal. This was a force of nature, an unstoppable killer who didn't play by the rules. For the first time, Kevin felt real fear, the kind of fear that made his heart pound and his legs feel weak. He ducked into a narrow alleyway, hoping to lose Jason in the maze of the city, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the killer found him. There was no escaping someone like Jason. Not for long. Kevin's lungs burned as he pushed through the dark alleys of Manhattan, the sound of Jason's footsteps never far behind. He couldn't shake him. No matter how fast Kevin ran, no matter how many twists and turns he took, Jason was always there, an ever-present shadow lurking at the edge of his consciousness. As he rounded a corner, Kevin spotted a fire escape ladder hanging just above his head. Without thinking, he jumped and grabbed hold, pulling himself up with all the strength he had left. His hands were numb from the cold, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he climbed higher, hoping to escape the nightmare below. But Jason was relentless. Kevin reached the roof, his body trembling with exhaustion, as he looked down at the street below. The alley was empty, Jason wasn't there. For a moment, Kevin allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he had lost him. That hope was short-lived. A heavy thud echoed behind him, and Kevin spun around to see Jason standing on the roof, his machete dripping with the blood of the wet bandits. Kevin's heart leaped into his throat. He had nowhere left to run. Desperation took over. Kevin raised the revolver, his hands shaking as he pointed it at Jason. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice filled with terror. "Stay away from me!" But Jason didn't stop. He never stopped. Kevin fired, the sound of the gunshots splitting the cold night air. But the bullet barely slowed Jason down. He kept moving, his eyes locked on Kevin. With a sudden burst of energy, Kevin turned and sprinted toward the edge of the roof. He had no plan, no idea how to escape, only the primal instinct to survive. As Jason closed in, Kevin leaped from the roof, the cold wind whipping through his hair as he fell through the air. He hit the next rooftop hard, rolling to his feet in a daze. But there was no time to stop. He could hear Jason behind him, the killer's steps never faltering. Kevin ran, his heart pounding, his breath visible in the freezing air. He had to keep moving. He had to survive. As Kevin sprinted through the maze of rooftops, his mind raced with fear and exhaustion. He had managed to outsmart criminals before, but Jason Voorhees was different. Jason was something else entirely, a force of unstoppable violence. Kevin's legs burned with fatigue as he pushed himself harder than he ever had. But he knew it wasn't enough. Jason was always there, always one step behind. Finally, Kevin reached the edge of the last rooftop, his heart sinking as he realized there was nowhere left to run. The drop below was too far, he couldn't jump again. And Jason was already closing in, his machete gleaming in the moonlight. For a moment, Kevin stood frozen, his back against the edge of the roof as Jason loomed over him. There was no escape, no clever traps, no last-minute tricks. This was the end. Jason reached out, his cold hand grabbing Kevin by the collar and lifting him off the ground. Kevin struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. Jason's grip was like iron, the machete raised into the air, glinting in the moonlight. And just as the blade began to descend, Kevin stood on the rooftop, heart pounding in his chest. As Jason loomed closer, his machete gleaming, Kevin had an idea. And it was the gun he picked up before. The revolver in Kevin's trembling hands was his only defense, but he knew it wasn't enough to stop Jason for good. The bullets had barely slowed him down. With Jason only a few feet away, Kevin's thoughts raced. He had to do something, anything to survive. Summoning all the courage he could muster, Kevin fired off the remaining rounds in the revolver, each shot echoing across the dark, cold rooftop. The bullets hit Jason, staggering him slightly, but they didn't stop him. The gun clicked empty, and Kevin's heart sank. But then an idea hit him. The shots were never meant to kill Jason, they were a distraction. Kevin turned and sprinted to the edge of the roof, his eyes scanning the street below. And there, in the middle of the square, stood the enormous Christmas tree, lit up with glowing lights, surrounded by the festive bustle of New York City. Just below the tree, Kevin spotted a large snowbank built up from the winter storms of the past few days. He took a deep breath, muttering a quick prayer under his breath. Please let this work. Please let me survive. Jason was closing in fast, his heavy footsteps thundering behind Kevin as he reached the edge of the building. Without another second to lose, Kevin took one last look at the massive figure of Jason, and then he jumped. Kevin's body soared through the air, the icy wind stinging his face as the city lights blurred around him. His heart raced, pounding in his ears as he plummeted toward the ground. For a split second, time seemed to slow. He felt weightless, the chaos of the night momentarily forgotten as he focused on the snowbank below. He braced himself for impact, closing his eyes as he crashed into the soft, freezing cushion of snow. The cold enveloped him, knocking the wind from his lungs, but he was alive. He had made it. Gasping for breath, Kevin scrambled out of the snowbank, his body shaking with adrenaline and the bitter cold. But there was no time to rest. He knew Jason would be following him. He always followed. Kevin darted through the bustling square, pushing past holiday shoppers and tourists who had no idea of the horror that was chasing him. The twinkling lights of the Christmas tree sparkled overhead, a cruel contrast to the nightmare he was living through. As Kevin ran, his eyes darted toward the nearby docks, the same docks that led to the river. A plan began to form in his mind. If Jason was unstoppable on land, maybe, just maybe, he could stop him in the water. Kevin sprinted toward the docks, his legs aching from exhaustion and fear, but he kept moving. Behind him, Jason emerged from the shadows, his imposing figure stalking through the streets, moving with the same relentless determination that had brought him this far. Reaching the water's edge, Kevin scanned the area, searching for anything that could help him. Then he saw it. A thick, rusted chain coiled near the edge of the dock, attached to a weathered post. It was old, heavy, and perfect for what he had in mind. Jason's slow, deliberate footsteps echoed behind Kevin as the killer approached, machete raised. Kevin had only seconds to act. He grabbed the chain, his hands trembling, and quickly looped it into a makeshift noose. He crouched low, hiding just behind the post, waiting. Jason was close now, too close. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Kevin kicked the chain toward Jason's legs, the cold metal tangling around them. Jason stopped for a moment, looking down in confusion, but before he could react, Kevin yanked hard on the chain. The rusted links tightened, trapping Jason's legs. Jason stumbled, his machete falling to the ground with a metallic clatter. Kevin's heart raced as he saw his chance. With every ounce of strength he had left, Kevin pushed against Jason's massive body, forcing him toward the edge of the dock. "Get away from me!" Kevin shouted. Jason, tangled in the chain, lost his balance and teetered on the edge. His masked face turned toward Kevin, cold and emotionless. But Kevin didn't stop. With one final push, he shoved Jason into the water below. The killer plunged into the icy depths, the chain dragging him down. Kevin stood on the dock, breathless, watching as Jason's body disappeared into the dark, swirling water. For a moment, the surface rippled, but soon the water grew still. Jason Voorhees was gone. Kevin's legs trembled as he stumbled away from the docks, the adrenaline finally wearing off. His body ached, and his mind was numb from the terror he had just experienced. But somehow he had survived. He made his way through the city streets, the festive lights and sounds of Christmas washing over him like a comforting blanket. The giant Christmas tree stood tall in the square, just as it had before the nightmare began. Kevin's heart swelled with relief as he spotted a familiar figure standing at the base of the tree, his mother. "Mom!" Kevin cried, running toward her. His mother turned, her face lighting up with joy and relief as she saw him. She knelt, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "Kevin, oh, thank God you're safe." For a moment, everything was perfect. The chaos, the fear, the horror. It all melted away in the warmth of his mother's hug. Kevin's mind tried to push away the events of the night, to forget the nightmare he had lived through. Maybe it was over. Maybe it was all just a bad dream. Kevin woke the next morning in the warmth of his bed. The soft glow of Christmas morning filled the room, and for the first time since the night before, he felt safe. He blinked, rubbing his eyes as he looked around the room. It was quiet, peaceful, but the memory of what had happened still lingered. Jason, the chain, the icy water. It all felt so real, yet so impossible. Kevin shook his head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe his mind had played tricks on him. After all, killers like Jason didn't really exist, right? He climbed out of bed and turned on the TV, expecting to see the usual Christmas morning shows. But instead, the screen flickered to life with a breaking news report. "Breaking news out of New York City," the reporter said, her voice serious. "Authorities are investigating a grisly scene at Duncan's toy chest, where 2 bodies have been found. Early reports suggest foul play, with one witness describing what they called an unimaginable horror." Kevin's stomach dropped as the screen cut to footage of Duncan's toy chest. Police officers crowded the scene, and employees from the store spoke with reporters, their faces pale and shaken. "The place was wrecked. We found blood, broken toys, and bodies. I don't know who could have done something like this," one employee said, his voice trembling. Kevin's eyes widened in shock as he watched the report. It hadn't been a dream. It had all been real. The wet bandits, Jason, everything. He had survived. But the terror wasn't just in his head. He sat back on his bed, staring at the TV, the weight of the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. In on the front of Duncan's toy chest, the broken windows and dark interior standing as a stark reminder of the horror that had taken place. Kevin swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had survived. But Jason Voorhees, was he really gone?